Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your really busy schedule this afternoon to discuss the importance of Australian literature and how we can incorporate it in our classrooms with our students. Now, I understand it's been a really long day and we are all really eager to finish up and kind of head on home, so I'm going to keep this short. As you can see, I'm holding a pile of books, but don't worry, you won't have to read them. This is just a visual cue. See, I want us to think about the text that we are studying with our students. How many of them are Australian literature? Probably not many at all. More importantly, how many of them are from the perspective of an Indigenous Australian or written by an Indigenous Australian? My guess? Very few. In a survey conducted by the Australian Learning and Teaching Council, it was found that whilst many secondary teachers like the idea of incorporating rich Australian texts into their lessons, the accessibility and confidence in ability to discuss the texts was quite limited. In fact, 76% considered Australian literature to be an important priority in their lessons. However, when asked if it should be taught as a separate literature category, only 24% believed it should be taught separate from other texts. This means a staggering 64% of educators in Australia believe that Australian literature should be taught with other texts from around the world that represent key themes and context in society. So what we are seeing is that even though we want to be incorporating Australian literature into our lessons, most current educators feel that they either don't have enough time or knowledge required to introduce it as a separate module for learning. And that is really sad. So let's just take a moment and think back to when you were in high school. I want you to think for a moment on the texts that you read. Were any of them Australian literature? What is one Australian voice literature that you can remember reading back in high school? What perspective were they written from? Were they from a white Westerner perspective or from an Indigenous perspective? See, I'm going to share two, but let's note that both of the ones I'm about to share were from the perspective of a white person. The Secret River by Kate Grenville was the first book I ever remember reading in school that was centered around Indigenous life and the intensity of the life that was in the days of colonization. See, I remember the text put the Indigenous people in a bad light. A really bad light. The underlying themes and tones of the text centered around the life of those white settlers who were in danger from the Indigenous and faced fear and trauma and threats, whilst trying to create this new idyllic life for themselves and their families in this new, rough, uncertain terrain of Australia, where the Indigenous people were attacking them in every corner and killing them off. I remember reading this book feeling so sorry for the white characters in this text and wondered why the Indigenous people would be so cruel. Of course, I had no true inclination of what was really going on or the painful hidden truths that really occurred during that time of life. However, by the end of the book, you start to realize that nothing is actually what it seems, and that making connection with the Indigenous people through love and consideration was possible. That peace is possible. But of course, this is still from a white supremacy perspective. Okay, another book I read was something that I just used to casually flick through from time to time, and that was a book of Australian poems for children, written by Linsay, Claire Scott Mitchell, and Catherine Griffith, and that was written in 2002. These poems, from what I can remember, always seem to be from the perspective of a Westerner and their views of connection to land, their views of the wildlife, their views of how an Indigenous person would live. In fact, it actually wasn't until I took Australian literature subject that I actually started to realise just how one-sided literature has been for generations. The formats in which literature is presented and studied is shifting from the traditional outlets such as books to more accessible and transferable forms in this digital era. What we used to have in schools as a main literature resource is now taking a shift to things like spoken word, rapping, audio, movie texts, and screen texts. And this is actually reflected in the statistics found in the survey that was just mentioned before. When asked what format Australian literature teachers used mostly in their lessons, the highest response was written forms of poetry, lyrics, plays, and some essays. Film and television came in at top 2, and news, media, and music at top 3. So what this means was that texts such as stories, historical texts, online forums, blogs, legal texts, and political writings were all scarcely used or referenced in comparison. So it's clear to see that formats for literature are shifting. However, let us remember that these less traditional formats are not any less valuable in learning or teaching literature. See, audiobooks, music, and movies all hold rich formats of literature centered in deep ideologies and cultural perspectives, which require us to construct meaning to. The big focus I want to discuss with you is one impacting our literature choices and students today. See, it wasn't until 1967 that Indigenous Australians were finally recognised as citizens of Australia. Hooray! And since then, there's been a slow but steady progression of literature being published from the voice of the Indigenous. Between 2010 and present day, there has been an eruption of literacies in multimodal forms published from the perspective of an Indigenous person and culture. This shift has come at a time where we as a nation are being challenged to rethink and question the way that we know our history to be, and learn more about the truths of colonisation, settlement, and the dark tragedy days of the Western world and the impact that we had on the Indigenous Australians. For example, let's take AB Original's rap album Reclaiming Australia from 2016. Whilst it's not seen as a traditional source of literature in this postmodern world, it is well known and highly political and rich in layers of text that push the historical ideas of colonisation and native Australia well into the 21st century. Whilst their language is very harsh, violent, and quite potent, the impact of shaking listeners to their core and crying out for a shift in perspectives is highly effective. Poetry is becoming a more receivable source of literature in this generation. However, music and rap have become this generation's poetic output. For example, if we go back to the poem that we shared a few weeks ago by Darwin on the colonisation of Australia, yes, even though he never went to Australia and therefore never saw the terrain or terrors of the events that were to unfold, his literature was an idealistic piece in the form of a poem to inspire the British nation on the endless possibilities of life that awaited them in the New England. We noticed a very distinct and very diplomatic political source of literature. However, what we didn't see was the truth behind colonisation. In 2017, the film Sweet Country by Warwick Thornton came out and posed the idea of justice and how that was being impacted by the colonisation of Australia, especially on the Indigenous people. It brings into light the idea of homogeny, that is, the balance of power, how one group controls and influences another, which in this situation is white people through the domination of the Indigenous in the settlement period, and how that is something that we are still working through to this day in Australian culture. That's really bad. This also introduces the idea of the doctrine of terminus, or the manifest destiny, which suggests that the world would naturally assume that white settlers would expand across the continent and lord over it through farming and agriculture. Not cool, right? This idea of white supremacy and conquering the land for personal gain is seen regularly in the text mentioned today. Our traditional way of thinking has impacted our concept of history throughout literature for thousands of years. And now in a postmodern world, we find ourselves exposed to brand new layers and forms of literature where we are made to question history as we know it. This film, through many ways, aims to cause us to question the Australian myths and icons that we have been told and expressed to us through Western eyes and lives for generations. Something that generations later, people are speaking about in new art forms, such as AB Originals raps. And this is the literature that we should be discussing with our students today. Why? Well, we are in a generation of political freedom, Yeah, where every voice is told that it matters. So people are speaking out their truths, especially their historical truths. In these raps, we see an underlying message of outcry for justice, taking back what was taken from the Indigenous during the times of colonisation and settlement of Australia. We hear a strong war cry of resistance to the hegemonic forces of Western society, the government, the police, the justice system, even Centrelink and the media. We are now in a generation of youth and adults who aim to take back control of their destinies, shut down and call out political agendas that do not benefit them, and burn the bridge on the traditional ways of life. AB Original addresses these postmodern ideas in their songs, and the impact is really compelling. Through triggering blunt statements such as "walk into the courts like a walk in the park," which suggests that for an Indigenous person, merely going to a casual walk through a park could result in them ending up in court due to an unfair and unjust legal system. This generation is shouting out for justice and equality, but more than that, for freedom they believe the Indigenous deserve through everything that they have been put through by white supremacy. Other layers of profound meaning can be found in songs such as "I See You" and "Dead in a Minute," which talks about a short life expectancy that Indigenous Australians have, linking their experiences to those of African Americans. There's a line that says, "I hit 20, they said he might be lucky," and another, "When I was 15, they hit me with midlife crisis," when someone in the background screams, "You're dead!" Through the use of play on words, these artists hit core issues impacting Indigenous people today that are so easily dismissed about or not spoken about. Short life expectancy, the ineffectiveness of the Close the Gap campaign, institutional racism, and so much more. These are things that we need to be introducing and discussing with our students today. So I encourage you, take home a CD and have a listen, watch the movie, read some more books, and let's get these students hearing the real stories from the real voices. It is time for real history to come out. Have a great night. God bless.